want to thank you all for start off by thanking Barbara and Dorothy for this wonderful event, and all of those of you from Maria's behind you who've done so much to organise it. It's been really, really sort of exciting and inspirational. I hope we'll all go away energised with and waiting for the great agenda of things we're all going to do. It's quite difficult being the last panel because, of course, so much has been said. So what we're going to try and do is touch on things, ideally, that haven't been covered so much, or pick up on themes that individuals particularly want to speak about. What we have on this panel is a range of ages and experiences. So it is an intergenerational panel. We have both men and women, and so there's a little bit of breadth. We can't claim full breadth, obviously. And we cross different sectors of the arts. And we have dance and choreography and theatre, which perhaps have had slightly less representation than the visual arts, though there's a solid visual arts part of this panel too. If you'll forgive me, I'm just going to say a few words about my background, but also then move on to some of the sort of my experience as what I don't typically call of as my role as a leader. I earlier today called my role administrator, much to the amusement of some of my other colleagues and other members of this conference, but there's a message in that. I started reading English here at Murray Edwards, then New Hall, way back. We're declaring our generation, so I'm a baby boomer of the sort of the first bit. At the end of my 3 years here, I'd had a lovely time, but I decided I did not want to go on to be a teacher of English literature in a school, which was the most obvious and only route that was suggested by anybody to me. And I signed up for VSO, asking to go to Africa, and was sent to India. But that was a total sort of flip of my career. I was teaching Milton, Shakespeare, Tennyson, and all the other great canonical classics to very confused young Indian students aged between 18 and about 24, but ended up by teaching the older generation, so the older ones, older than me, I was just 21, and teaching for postgraduate degree when I only had a BA. So it was a very, very strange and interesting experience, but made me determined to understand India better. I came back to Cambridge. I then did a degree in social anthropology and a PhD, went back to India, and then with help from a very senior academic here who chaired the panel, but was also my PhD supervisor, got a curatorial job in the University Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. I can't say absolutely whether it was a fix or whether I was or wasn't, as well, properly the best candidate, but we'll never know. He's not with us now, and I can't ask him. Bless him. From there, I went to the V&A, and that. The experience in Cambridge was wonderful. It's a very small team, so actually there's a huge amount of potential to do things, which you often get in small institutions when you start a career. I think there's some great advantages starting in a smaller institution rather than a very large institution, because the scope to do things and to generate things is much greater. Then went to the V&A, where I had an equally fascinating, much longer experience of 21 years, and I just want to flag. There are many people I could flag, from Roy Strong, who appointed me, to many others. But I think the single most significant person was someone referenced yesterday by Maria as Dame Elizabeth Esteve-Coll, who was the much maligned first and only ever female director of the V&A, who then went on to the University of East Anglia, but retired rather early for ill health reasons, but is still happily going strong and doing all sorts of things. She was inspiration. She had a very unusual career, but she did a lot of things. Attacking some of the very fundamental issues in the museum, trying to build its infrastructure for the future. But one of the things she did with those of us who were lucky enough by that stage to be in reasonably high positions, heads of departments and so on, was to offer us all, along with an ex-British Council colleague who was doing the training and development, experience of other skills that we might want to develop. Some went on to do curatorial programs before coming back. I did a management course at Henley Management College. I learned something about finance. I learned about corporate management. It wasn't long, but I was woken up to the real world and how organizations operate. It's a strand that's played around a little bit, and it certainly set me up very considerably for my subsequent career at the V&A, and also when I applied for the Courtauld directorship, which to my huge amazement I got because I had no background in art history. I didn't know much about European art histories at all because I worked on India. And as the chair of the panel said, well, don't worry, we're not going to expect you to lecture on Botticelli. There are people much with training like Luke's who could do that for us. But I think my route to taking on those responsibilities was slow. And I think that's one of the things that I've been very aware of in this discussion with a lot of both people of my era and also those in middle career and younger, is that there's now, that might have been because I was a woman, it might have been because of my personality, it's difficult to tell. I certainly passed by some opportunities for higher positions in the meantime. I think probably I was ready by the time in my late 50s that I took on the Courtauld. I'm now aged. I should not be there if we want to leave places to younger people, and I won't be there forever, I promise everybody who's going to come after. But there's a sense that having been so late getting into a position where you could affect an institution, you sort of want to put your heart and soul into and things in academic institutions and indeed museums, it takes a heck of a lot of time to make changes. So that's why I'm still around, and probably, as I say, oughtn't to be around, and I will peel off before too long, I promise everyone, opening up a good opportunity, a really exciting opportunity for others to help continue to shape the Courtauld. We are trying at the Courtauld to do a lot of transformation things, but they're sort of, and maybe it'll come back in some of the discussion, echoing some of the things that Maria was talking about for Tate. On the academic side, we're certainly pushing very hard to absolutely open out, push it right against the sort of the narrow version of the canon of art history. I mean, I think that's one of the most important things, and getting people into the teaching community who reflect much wider experience and ranges of art history, as well as all the work that is going on sort of reinvestigating the art histories that we already do, looking at them in a post-colonial perspective, looking at obviously the feminist and the queer theory have all been there for some time. Much more to be done. We're still sort of on our way, and the progress will continue, I think, steadily. We have, in terms of gender, we have a heavily feminized organization. I mean, it's not only me as a leader, but the senior management team is predominantly feminine, and the student body is too. And there's strong feminine presence right across the piece. The governing board, slightly less so, but it's getting evened out, and we are not good in terms of wider, certainly ethnic diversity. I know that diversity is problematic, but we're less inclusive in those areas. On gender and sexual orientation, we're not so bad as it happens. But we're much more aware. I think this is the question of data has come up quite a lot. We are now much more self-conscious, much more aware of all these issues. So I think we've become a much more self-conscious organisation. We're not where we want to be. There's a lot more to be done, but we keep on trying to push forward with small steps. What I would just say is that leadership in any context is tough, whatever gender you are, whatever it makes no odds. It's tough. Taking on responsibility is tough. And of course, even as a leader, you're always accountable to lots of other people who can themselves affect and determine, even when you want to do something, you can't always carry them through. So it's a question, as I think Maria said, of if you get knocked down, you just have to pick yourself up and carry on. And I think all of my panel have done that already, in their respective careers and ways. So I want to turn to them each to say a bit about what they're doing and to talk about leadership in the context in which they're working, whatever stage in career they are. And I think some of the themes that have emerged in the conversations of the last day will reassert themselves, and so there'll be some new perspectives, I think, from their experience. So I'm going to pass them to Charlotte first.
Thank you, Deborah. It's been so inspiring hearing everyone speak, and I feel so charged and encouraged, and I hope I can channel many of the discussions into the work that I'll be doing soon. But Deborah said I'm a choreographer. I love movement. I love how it can be an important source of expression and a tool for creativity. And I found that out when I was 4 years old. My mum is a single parent, and she needed somewhere for me to go so she could focus on her work. So I remember turning up at my first dance class in a t-shirt and shorts. And at the end of the class, the teacher said, I'm going to put a piece of music on, and this section is called the improvisational section, where you have the freedom to move however you wish. And this was electric. I couldn't believe the feeling that I had come across. And it was so brilliant for me to discover that at that point, because I am dyslexic, and school was a pretty hard place, many obstacles that I was facing, and many challenges, and I just felt like I didn't have many avenues to go down. So I put quite a lot of pressure on myself to move into the arts, as that was something I was passionate about, and I could just remember this feeling. So my mum encouraged me to audition to vocational dance schools, and I trained at the Royal Ballet Lower School for 5 years, and then continued my training at Rumbear, which is a contemporary-based school. Within my training, I was so vocal about loving choreography, and I entered competitions within the school. This was great because the contemporary teacher offered me a position as I transitioned from White Lodge to Rumbear to have a commission with her company, the York Dance Project, and Yolanda York-Edgell really opened this door for me. Sort of simultaneously, the director of the Royal Ballet, Kevin O'Hare, was judging these competitions and knew that I had an appetite to be a choreographer. There was conversation around the time about the lack of women within the industry, and they, as in Wayne McGregor, the resident choreographer, and Kevin O'Hare, curated this inaugural young choreographer position, which was a lifetime opportunity. I mean, I was incredibly lucky to have that and sort of move on to that. It was eye-opening in terms of seeing how Kevin O'Hare, the director of the Royal Ballet, led the company, seeing how choreographers would orchestrate a room or facilitate a rehearsal. And I feel within that time, I thrived in some areas, failed in others, and it really helped kind of sculpt and shape me to progress into a freelance career, which is where I am now, working predominantly with companies in Europe, which I'd love to touch on a bit later, which is fascinating coming from a leadership point of view, understanding the ways in which these different organisations and companies are working as an outsider coming in. More recently, I've set up a company in lockdown called Move Beyond Words. Move Beyond Words is a company that amplifies the voices of dyslexic artists. It's something I never discussed until now, and now I talk about my dyslexia quite a lot. And we were unable to host some of our live events as we see the importance of bringing people together and discussing differences or similarities and how we can improve or learn from each other. But we created this podcast and had speakers like Adele Tracy, who's an athlete, a British athlete, Dame Darcy Bustle, former principal dancer with the Royal Ballet, Stella Tilliard, historian and writer. And just hearing these incredible women speak about the challenges that they faced was eye-opening. And I feel like in the pandemic, it's quite a lonely place, especially for freelancers. So that was fantastic. And that kind of takes me to, I can't wait to speak about, well, we've spoken a lot about female empowerment, but yeah, joining these conversations now with leadership. It's me.
We'll move on and we'll come back to your
that was my end.
Experience in Europe, which I know would be very interesting. Sam, over to you. Yeah.
Thank you, and afternoon, everybody. Just initially, a thank you for the invitation to come along today. It's been really interesting to sit and listen, and I feel a little bit like a fish out of water being on stage. There's a reason why I work in the administration side of theatre. I'd much prefer to be behind the curtain rather than in front of it, but I'll give it a go to see how we go here. But looking back on my reflections of knowing that I was coming to speak today, I sort of looked back through the work that I've done in small-scale theatre in the West End, and now I work as general manager at the Old Vic. And I've always worked for and with women in positions, in leadership positions that I've always sort of looked up to, and that sort of stems initially from my mother, as we lived on site at the theatre that we ran as a family for the first 20 years of my life. So it's sort of like embedded in me that women were in these leadership roles, and then it's accidentally or otherwise happened throughout my career to get to that point. But I came up against a slight difference once I started working in the West End, that I think there's a huge problem within our industry in terms of visibility of female representation in the industry, in that I think you'd probably still say the decision makers and I'll talk about the West End just because that's probably the most easily recognisable side of theatre, are probably still all white old men. But more often than not, you'll find that they're backed up by a team of predominantly women in the administration and the actual doing of the job side of things, rather than having the long lunches. It's something that I've experienced as I've gone through the industry. And just to give you a sort of bit of context of where women seem to be at in the theatre industry, is that within my sort of work colleagues, I guess it's probably about 80% women in the workforce in the administration side of the theatres that I've worked in. We all know that audiences in theatre are predominantly female. They're the ticket buyers as well. Yet when you get up to the senior leadership positions, more often than not, the artistic directors are men, and the directors and the playwrights are men. It's probably about 20-30% female directors and female playwrights, and those are figures probably from about 5-6 years ago, so that might have changed now. But we've got a long way still to go in theatre, and being part of these discussions, I think, is a great point. I mean, not least that, and I probably shouldn't say it in this, given where I am now, but I'll say it anyway, that the National Theatre has only ever had 5-6 artistic directors. They've all been white men. And this current one is the first white man who wasn't Cambridge educated. So there's quite a long way to go from that, just to get more representation. But I think from peers that I speak to within the industry, when big leadership roles or any leadership role, senior role is coming up within theatre, there is very definitely a move now for it to be, it just can't be a man. We can't keep going to that white men default, which seemed to have been what it was forever, and those roles only come up every so often, so that change is slow, but I think and believe it is happening, I think I'll probably leave it there. I mean, we're going to talk a little bit about organisational culture and stuff, but just to hopefully give a bit of context about the theatre industry as a general point.
Thanks, Sam. That's lovely. Yeah. Naomi.
Thank you, Deborah. So, yes, I'm so pleased to be here. I was struck, though, by the fact that when Charlotte and I met each other yesterday, one of the first things we said to each other was that we felt like imposters being on this panel. And having listened to all of the talks today, I think we need to banish that from our minds and be proud of having been invited and to take up space in this way as young women. But I just, so I'm a curator and an art writer, and have the absolute privilege of being assistant curator at New Hall Art Collection at the moment. I'm covering the curator Harriet Loeffler's second maternity leave, and the post, as Barbara mentioned, is being funded this year by Griselda Pollock, who used the money from winning the Holberg Prize, which is an unbelievable achievement because it's a prize for academics in all disciplines, and I think it was the first time that an art historian ever won it. And she's used that money to go towards funding curatorial and research posts, mainly for women, to promote women artists. And I think this is the most amazing example of feminism in practice in the workplace. So Harriet and I are both incredibly grateful to her. And I listened to a podcast interview that she gave after winning the prize, and was really struck by something that she said, which was that when she was at the Courtauld in the early 70s, it was a majority of women, undergraduates, and quite a small minority of men, but she felt that the young men there were being groomed for museum director roles, and that the women were just sort of padding, and that they would graduate and then they would maybe become housewives, maybe, you know, if they were lucky, they would teach or something, but they weren't destined for these kind of leadership positions. And when I was at the Courtauld a few years ago, it's a very different story now. I had amazing role models in Deborah, for example, but also women leaders, museum directors, such as Frances Morris and Maria Balshaw, who we heard from yesterday. And I completely recognise that if I were a woman of colour or a disabled woman or a working class woman, that wouldn't be the case still. So there is definitely a lot of work to be done. But I was also struck by the word that she used, groomed, because I feel that actually she was suggesting that those young men were in some ways victims of having been given these roles of extraordinary responsibility at a very young age. And we are very used to seeing young men, young male museum directors who don't really have very much experience at all and are suddenly given responsibility over enormous collections, enormous staff, and leadership is, as Deborah said, a huge challenge often. You're responsible to a lot of different people. And also, I think that there are two ways in which it goes. There's an external responsibility that you have to represent your institution or your organisation, and then there's the internal one where you're managing your employees. And sometimes those two things don't join up. And I do want to talk a bit more about women supporting each other in the workplace. But just quickly on the point of these young male directors, I went to a talk with Charles Summery Smith recently, and he has been director of seemingly every single London museum. He was director of the National Gallery and then the National Portrait Gallery and the Royal Academy. And he was very frank, actually, about how disastrous his directorship at the National Gallery was because, well, he was probably being self-deprecating, but he said that the job was destined for was written for an internal candidate. And there were two internal candidates that went for it, and they divided the trustees down the middle. And so he, naively having applied for it, thinking he had a chance, ended up actually getting the job without having very much experience at all. But the effect of this was that there was a huge amount of hostility internally towards him. So he, on his first day, went around the museum trying to meet the curators, and none of them had shown up. So it was an empty museum that he was having to deal with. So I think that there is a difference in how quickly men and women can achieve leadership roles. And sometimes the ideal of being a sort of wunderkind museum director isn't one that necessarily we should promote as the best option. And sometimes having years of experience and maturity in order to deal with challenges can be a good thing. But back to my earlier point that I alluded to about women supporting each other in the workplace, I think that sometimes female directors can have a really brilliant message that they convey externally while not necessarily practicing it internally. And I'm very lucky because I've had some unbelievably supportive female mentors. So, for example, I did a placement at Tate Modern when I was doing my master's, and I was working with an assistant curator there, Monica Bayer-Wittmuth. I want to name her because she was so incredibly supportive to me, and I am still in touch with her, and she gave me interesting work and gave me advice, and she was brilliant. And similarly with Harriet here, even just giving me the opportunity to cover her position, even though I'm much junior to her, I think is a real privilege, and she has given support in many other ways as well. But I have also heard real horror stories of women not supporting each other in the workplace, and particularly I think in the commercial art world where there's a lot of competitiveness. So one example is it was a totally female working environment. All the employees were women, and it's a gallery that represents a lot of women artists. So sort of on the surface, which, as Kate said, is quite unusual. So on the surface, it's a kind of feminist enterprise, but my friend who got a job there, her boss told her, her female boss told her that the other employees didn't actually want her to be there, and that one of them had cried when they found out that she was joining. And at first, I think she concluded that this female boss was actually just looking out for the other employees and taking their feelings on board, but then quickly realized that this was a way of making her feel unwelcome in the workplace. So I think that it's not just a question of representation. I think it's also a question of how people treat each other. But I think that often it's when people don't feel supported themselves, they can't be supportive of others. And so opening up questions about the menopause and things like that, which can be a reason why older women potentially aren't as supportive of younger women. I think that kind of thing is so important. So I think that's my message.
That's really just thanks so much, Naomi. Yeah. Passing over then to Luke.
So I wanted to start by, first of all, saying who I am again. I'm the director of the Fitzwilliam Museum here in Cambridge. It's the university museum that looks after those parts of the world that were deemed in around 1900 to be civilized as opposed to primitive. So there's a lot to deal with even before I begin in terms of what the contents of the museum represent. And I guess I should also perhaps talk about what I represent. Barbara, when I talked to her last night, talked about male allies, and what I want to be very clear about is that I'm not, and I don't want anybody to think that I'm presenting myself as a paragon. I've learnt an enormous amount by listening to the conversations of this today and from Maria's presentation last night. But I do, I suppose, want to do my best to institute change and to support change in a systematic and systemic way. I came to the Fitzwilliam 2.5 years ago from the Metropolitan Museum in New York. I've now had a 30-year museum career, starting at the British Museum in my 20s, where I was primarily supported, I have to say, by somebody called Caroline Elam, who opened doors for me. And it was a very traditional curatorial career. I studied Italian Renaissance art, I published, I did exhibitions. None of them, I think, were particularly radical, although I was always interested in politics and the way politics political identities were enshrined in works of art. And I think it took really going to the Met and perhaps its particularly conservative approach, the approach that comes from a body that is supported almost entirely from private philanthropy, and the very rich of a city which tends to be highly conservative in its approach, that in an odd kind of way re-radicalized me, took me back to my youth, took me back to my own political heritage in my family, a family of women, communist grandparents, an anarchist great-grandmother, and I found that again, and I found it again in a particular meeting. I remember I talked about this earlier on in our group, where I'd never, despite having made statements when I was young, I'd never ever talked about my sexuality in a professional context until I was 50. And I found myself in a meeting where we were talking about the join-up between different kinds of exhibitions going on at the Met, and they were saying, we've got Michelangelo and Hockney coming out. Well, I said, well, that one's easy. And they said, what? What's the connection between Michelangelo and Hockney? And I said, well, obviously, they're two of the greatest gay artists that have ever lived. And they laughed, and I was mortified, actually. It was an extraordinary moment, and it was a moment when I really felt at that point that I needed to start making sure that the kinds of claims that I'd made in my head to excuse going into a profession that I loved, but wasn't the kind of sense of social responsibility that my parents, my grandparents, and others had taken on in their political lives. That needed not to be just a thing about the social responsibility of the museum or the cultural organisation. It needed to be something that was becoming true. I can give you just two examples, and then I just want to use a few key words. Yesterday, I had two emails. One was, did we want to give a comment to the Daily Telegraph, who were asking us about our woke acquisitions policy because we bought 2 pieces of ceramics in a sale that celebrated the abolition of slavery. And I thought, well, no, actually we don't, not to the Telegraph, not in that way. This is just not going to be the place. But somebody asked me a very sensible question earlier today about, are there opponents here? And yes, there are opponents. This is a fight. We need to be absolutely clear what we're talking about here. There is, as Griselda said, there are people who are arraigned against change, who do not want this to happen. And that's a real thing, and it's sitting at the heart of government. It's sitting in the Department of Culture, Media and Sport. I just want to be clear about that. And that's their allies in the right-wing press and in other places as well. I'm sorry to bring politics into it, but these are practical things around holding funding over our heads. The funding round is coming up. Arm's length principles of governance and organisation, which are being undermined systematically across the board in the name of levelling up, of other activities which are, in my view, fraudulent and party politically motivated. In case you were wondering where I came from. And so that was one thing. And the second one was a note from the university's HR department talking about academic career progression. They'd forgotten to send it to the Fitzwilliam to begin with, and so suddenly they remembered that we have academic researchers in the museum. And what did we think of the policy? And our HR manager, slightly maligned, I thought, by somebody earlier today, said, you need to be aware that this is a self-nominating system. So women are less likely to nominate themselves for promotion than men, and therefore this is going to be producing a gender gap in terms of seniority and pay. And you need to point this out. And so I thought, hooray, thank you. This couldn't be more brilliantly timed in terms of what I've just been listening to, and this is one of my tasks for this evening, is to send that email off. So in other words, what I think one's talking about here is different forms of leadership, which are about battle, they're about vigilance, they're about constant vigilance, they're about system. They're about instilling checks and balances and systematic methods within organizations that mean that you're always embedding these principles in everything that you're doing and that you're testing yourself again in certain ways all the time. I learned this painfully and gradually. I'm not going to pretend it came to me immediately and easily. I worked with Sheena Wagstaff, formerly of Tate Modern, on a show at the Met called Like Life, Sculpture, Colour and the Body. Some of you heard me talk about this at lunchtime today. Every single time we reviewed the loan list, we looked at the gender balance and we looked at how many artists of colour we were including in the show. And we made sure that what we were doing was vibrant and balanced. To begin with, as a historian of historic art, I was very unused to this system and found it sort of strangely uncomfortable and mechanical. But it gave rise to something which didn't feel mechanical. It felt exciting and balanced and unusual and taking people in directions that they hadn't done. And then I'm just going to finish by saying that the difficulty for me was that personally, and I think that goes on being true in a Fitzwilliam that is wrestling now with some of the same issues, is that in that 50-50 divide, almost all the women artists represented were working after 1900 and most of them after 1970. So in other words, there was no history of women's creation that I could find easily that tackled the subject. Now, it wasn't as obviously there was a lot more in the last, say, 40 years since the 70s, no, I suppose it's 50 years now, isn't it, since the 70s of work on women artists than there ever was. There is still, however, a tendency to say, oh, let's celebrate Artemisia over here, but let's pay much less for an Artemisia Gentileschi than an Orazio Gentileschi when you buy it at the National Gallery. And there's still a sense that this is a token activity within some of the, and this is another distinction I wanted to draw. I drew it in the question I asked earlier on, between profoundly entrenched organizations like mine, like the National Theatre, where, you know, getting away from Cambridge-educated white men is seemingly proving incredibly hard, with radical, exciting new initiatives like Black Bottoms that we heard about before, you know, which are challenging organizations like that. I think part of the task is to put those organizations together in ways that funders can help us achieve, and finding the funding and finding the structures and finding the systems to make sure that we're doing this in the right way is important, but also undertaking the research where we're looking at history of creativity that, say, for example, investigates a history of flower painting. Not a fashionable subject, but if you look at a history of flower painting, you find woman artist after woman artist of enormous distinction. And if you look at the history of waxwork making, Madame Tussauds was not alone. There's a whole history that goes right back to 1600 that takes you all the way through into the 19th century of women entrepreneurs, of women specialists in making sculpture and wax for anatomical hospitals, for again, flowers and so on and so forth. And these are fascinating histories, but they're not easily accessible. The works are often ephemeral and lost, and we have to reconstruct those histories. One of the things and I'll finish now, one of the projects I'm most excited about at the moment is, or rather one of the conversations, it's not yet a project, that we're having is with a collector who has been specializing in identifying work by European women artists from the 17th and 18th centuries primarily, through patient detective work with a team of scholars and restorers, finding work. So he sent me an email, it's a he actually, sent me an email about a woman called Mary Grace. Only one portrait so far identified. It's a self-portrait. He's done it for a process of deduction about where she was trained, where this comes from, and so on and so forth. It's an entire oeuvre of works, but which are being sold in sale rooms as follower of X or school of this or studio of that, and it's still hidden. It's still there, and institutions like mine still need to be going out and recreating and making and finding those histories, so that when we're talking about our identity now, we have as complete a sense of what our creative histories really are and how we celebrate those.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Luke. That's great. I think what has happened in the discussion hitherto, and then in everything that my colleagues on the platform have said, is that the multi levels that the manifesto has to embrace, and we will all undoubtedly engage in different ways, some multiply, some singly, and so on. But I just wanted to just do a quick work around, which is the whole question, because we talked about it earlier a little bit, but how you change institutional culture. So it's a relatively quick thing before we open up to the audience. Charlotte, you have worked in a number of different countries.
Yes.
And you talked to me earlier about how in going into a new country, there's a very strong, you realized immediately that you're in a different context. Yeah. Now, most of us just stay in one culture and often in one organization. So I think you will be highly attuned to sort of, let's say, smelling a culture of an organization or thinking about it in a very interesting way. So perhaps you could just say a few words about that, and then I'm going to move on around the group again.
Well, I've noticed globally that there's a lack of women within my industry as choreographers. That's the first observation that I make when I go into these amazing dance houses. But working with the dancers, they're highly competitive people. And as Maria said yesterday, she had that gymnastic energy, that kind of turbulent, visceral encouragement. And I feel like walking into a room, I sort of get a sense of who the dancers are. And recently working in Munich with the Bavarian State Ballet, they were requesting a completely different way of working to how I work with someone here with Northern Ballet, for example. And I didn't realise this until I was in the moment and having to kind of adapt and change. And it may have been that there's a completely different a breadth of nationalities, Brazilians, Russians, Germans, and that really tested me as an artist to think about leadership from that capacity, or at least facilitation. But also when working with directors with Dutch National Ballet or with these different companies, I have actually noticed there's a slight lack of communication. I think I always want to have a conversation about why are we creating this work? You know, we're kind of discovering how and where, but why? And it's sometimes quite a lonely process. It's quite interesting to understand that the director hasn't always got a presence within the room, and that's something that I've kind of completely picked up on. But I would just say that with each country, with each organisation, the experience of the dancers, the kind of the structures that are in place, the mannerisms around the room, the etiquette. You know, there's so many factors that if I'm there for a week or 2 weeks, it's a bit of a shapeshifter, which has been valuable in terms of trying to find a way of leading. But I think there's one thing I've realised: I lose sight of myself if I don't retain at least 50%, at least. And it's fantastic to get inspiration from all these places. But I do also recognise that it is very male-dominated. And what I didn't say in my talk is when I had this fantastic opportunity, I noticed that there were many women surrounding me who have more experience, that I could see they were bruised. I could see that they had lost a massive lack of confidence. And it feels like we haven't quite progressed in dance, I feel, in the past 7 years or so. Maybe a small progression, but only so far. And obviously I'm speaking here about these big houses. Something that was mentioned earlier, especially in galleries as well, was the scalability of work and where women's work is published or performed. And I think it only gets so far within these kind of theatres, the small scale or mid-scale stages. And that's it. I feel like I've gone in a massive rant then.
Yeah, no, it's really, really interesting. But I'm going to pick up on one aspect of what we talk, which I want Sam to respond to, which is this sense of how do you get in an organisation that the whole organisation really understands where you're heading and what. So it's back to your why question,
right?
And Luke's thing about how do you shape a programme? Because ultimately, the programme is what the public are going to see. If we're all producers for an audience in one form or another. But how do you get, and you're a general manager, so how do you get the guys who are working backstage, the people at the box office, understanding what the total project is? I mean, we certainly sort of tried to do a lot of thinking about this, not yet there, but I know you've done quite a lot on this yourself.
Yeah, it's as I talk about something not so nice to start with, is that where we've recently got to at the Old Vic is from the back of a not very nice experience that we went through with our previous artistic director in Kevin Spacey and all the stuff that came out about him in the recent years. And what that in a good way enabled us as an organisation to do was to really hold up a mirror to ourselves and work out what our culture was as a place to come and work as a freelancer just coming in to do a day as a fight director, or if you're with us as an actor for 3 months, or if you work in the finance department, or whatever it is across the board. What would you expect when you came to the Old Vic? And we did a lot of work around that, and we're still doing a lot of work around that. And I think the two sort of main takeaways from my side of things in very broad brushstrokes are that we've got a really good, clear idea of what our culture is now, and we don't half go on about it every single time we get the opportunity to at a meet and greet, at a staff meeting. We're just sort of embedding it and ramming it home all the time that now these routes to raise a concern, speak to people, support mechanisms that are there are there, and that these are what they are, and this is how you get to them. And the one big thing that we developed off the back of the sort of horrible 6 months that we went through was a scheme called the Guardian Scheme at the Old Vic, which is a group of people who I am one of at the Old Vic. There's about 6 to 7 of us across the workforce. And we've been sort of trained up in the policies and the sort of culture of the organisation. And we're there as like a confidential sounding board for anybody in the organisation just to come and sense check stuff with us. If you've experienced something in a rehearsal room or overheard something in an office or whatever, and you don't quite feel like it's sitting right with you, you can come and chat to me confidentially, or we've roughly got one person in every department and at various levels of seniority throughout the organisation. Because what we discovered through part of the discovery, as part of all the allegations that were flying about a couple of years ago, was that there may have been stuff that was going on, but nobody raised anything. And nobody knew. What we then sort of took that to be was that nobody knew maybe where to raise stuff or how to raise stuff, or had confidence in the culture of the organisation that it would be dealt with in the right way. So trying to sort of flip around that oil tanker, and it's a very different place now that we've got a new artistic director, but that takes time, and that has been a big project, and it is something that we still have to just keep going at all the time. But we sort of bore ourselves with it, but it's an important thing to bore ourselves with, if you know what I mean. So yeah, we talk about it a lot.
And looking at this from your perspective, Naomi, I think I'm finding it more and more useful, and it's been mentioned a lot around the room, is to get people of your generation to it's the upward mentoring as being invaluable, because I have no children of myself, my own, and very few in our family, and I feel very divorced from the 21-year-olds or the 25-year-olds. One of the great appeals of going to the court hall with lots of young people. But how do you see you yourself, for example, developing a role in helping the upward exchange of views intergenerationally?
Yeah, well, I think reverse mentoring has been mentioned quite a few times during this conference, and it's something that can be incredibly effective, a sort of two-way conversation. And one of the questions that we're answering on this panel is what do we want from our leaders? And I think that something that we want from them is for them to listen to us and to take us seriously, whoever we are. I think that perhaps is a shift recently. I have a couple of friends who are medical students, and they're obsessed with the term paternalism, and they always talk about how the NHS has become much less paternalistic over the course of the last generation. And I think that's actually true more generally of society, that before, leaders were supposed to be these strong, infallible figures who we sort of trusted absolutely, whereas now we have a much more complicated view of what leadership is, and I think it's becoming much more acceptable to change your opinions and to adapt to an evolving society and culture. And one of the ways to do that is, of course, to hear from younger generations. And you know, I'm one of 4 girls, and my older sister, there's a 12-year range between my older sister and my younger sister, so we sort of straddle different generations. So my older sister is firmly a millennial, and my younger sister is Gen Z. And actually having my younger sister, who's 17, around teaches me so much about generational shifts, and just seeing her responses to the same things is fascinating, because just in these 10 years, so much has changed. And I think the rate of change at the moment is very accelerated in a positive way, but we all need to find ways of keeping up with it. And I think that means that we need to be forgiving of people who maybe haven't quite caught up with it yet, and that, you know, terminology and language is changing very fast, and people should certainly educate themselves about it, but we need to be generous in the way that we communicate with one another and hopefully, strive for a better world together. I think I'm maybe giving a sort of overly optimistic view of collaboration between everyone, because I also recognise that, something that we've talked about is kind of resistance and a lack of desire to kind of relinquish one's place of privilege and power. So there is definitely tension in that, but I am an optimist. I always thought that the pandemic was going to be over next week. I've been proven wrong time and time again, but I have endless optimism in change as well, more generally.
Lovely. Luke, just a few words just before we open it to the audience, but where, as a leader, where do you turn to for support? Where do you get, where do you want to get that resource that anybody in a position of responsibility actually needs?
It's an extraordinarily complex question, I said, so not least in Cambridge University, it has to be said. But it's a great one. I think it's support and advice and counselling and mentoring of all the kinds that we talked about. And I think that can come and should come from many different places. I was really pleased to hear earlier on a discussion about how a group of students wrote to the University of Cambridge Museums, and that's created a dialogue which I haven't been actually physically part of, but believe me, it comes back and informs what we're doing, and we're beginning to build into systems, probably much too belatedly, representation of Cambridge students, but actually other young people into our systems of governance, and to make sure that, and I know I keep going on about governance, but actually I think it's really important to set these principles in place where you don't have to rely on remembering each time they're there. They're there and they're in. So I think that's one key thing. Barbara asked about peer groups and organisations earlier on as well. It's there, but I think often we feel that our struggles are more individual than they are collective. I know that institutions and organisations which have made efforts in different areas have the individuals within them have felt isolated and attacked. The Museum of the Home, for example, or at the National Trust, or at a number of other organisations where people have tried to make a difference, and where the newspapers, right-wing commentators, and indeed government, I'll keep on saying this, have turned on them, and there hasn't been a clear support network. I think there hasn't similarly been a concerted, unified effort, but I think it's now beginning, actually under Maria's leadership, who now chairs the National Museum Directors Council. And with her support, the University Museums Group and the Civic Museums Group are getting together to articulate clearly what it is that we're trying to do in terms of amplifying our narrative, of making it more representative, making it more inclusive, making sure that people who come to our museums or visit our websites or experience our research and our collections see themselves and understand each other better as a result of that experience. That is a different thing from the kinds of things that the large public is being told that we're doing. Stories, for example, that came up just last week about the Institute for the Museum for Classical Archaeology here in Cambridge, and these are stories which have some seed of truth, but which are distorted for deliberate effect. To derail the efforts that we're making at the moment. And I think we're beginning to try and work out what the language looks like, what the messaging feels like, because this is about systems and processes, as I talked about on the one hand, and the support in creating those is crucial. And it's about advocacy and message on the other. This is the question was asked earlier on, how do we find out about what this work is and how will we find out about it accurately? Well, it's up to people to get, individuals, even somebody running a beautiful museum in Cambridge cannot penetrate sometimes this wall of opposition unless we do it in a phalanx.
So we've probably talked too long. I apologise, Barbara, but can we now? Is there time to open it up for questions? Because we'd love some. Yeah.
After that, I think people will start getting tired.
Yes. Yeah.
Especially the ages at the end, so just hang in there for a bit.
A question of it. Yes. There 1, 2, 3. So 1, 2, 3 here.
Thank you. I just keep coming back to what Melanie said this morning about I can't wait for Black Blossoms to be problematic, and I feel like this idea of like how we build into our leadership structure a way for criticism, space for criticism not to be a brittle defect, like to be received and to kind of be backed into a corner, and that kind of idea that actually that is a dialogue and that there is how do we build a space that is kind of allows for criticism and robust criticism that doesn't necessarily mean that no progress has ever been made, that sort of denigrates progress and prior successes. I'm a casting director that was in-house, works in theatre and film, and I was in-house at Shakespeare's Globe for a long time, and just thinking about what Barbara was saying about practical things that can be done to change, how to make change. I worked under 3 artistic directors there, one who had been in place for 11 years, one who was in place for 2 years, very high profile, publicly resigning after only 5 months, and then I worked as a producer under the current artistic director, and I was made redundant last year. But the practicalities of the as casting director, when Emma Rice came in, she wanted to put quotas in place for casting, and it was gender equal casting, and making sure that at least 50% of the company were from a non-white background, and then Michelle Terry, when she came into place, made that more specific. It was about representing Southwark. We are a theatre in Southwark. What does that look like? Southwark has this demographic, and that breakdown wanted to be represented in the casting, which was really brilliant and immediately had a very clear impact on the way that the companies looked like that they were put together. However, we as an organisation didn't necessarily have at the same time the infrastructure to support that suddenly very different demographic that was brought into the organisation. And so young actors of colour, young new staff who would come, and in fact Claire, who's here somewhere, was a Globe Educational Assistant, and I think there is a kind of understanding that if you are in the audience seeing suddenly representation on stage, oh my God, I want to come and work here, it looks like that, coming into actually a majority white organisation that had a very good front-facing, like we do this very well, and had definitely big strides in terms of prior work. But as an organisation and as a majority white organisation, we didn't have the infrastructure to understand what other support needed to be in place. And then there was a real anxiety on the part of the leadership to respond to that criticism. And there was no real kind of support. So suddenly you're in a position where you are both platforming a much more diverse, much more representative and much group of people, but withdrawing on the same hand, or not being ready to accept, actually, well, if you do that, we also need this or and suddenly that then becomes a position of going, oh, but I didn't really, so where do you get, exactly as you were saying, Naomi, about that kind of generosity, but that generosity, the responsibility of that generosity has to be on the powerful people to accept that criticism, not the constant generosity being like, I know you're trying, but I'm just going to point out bits. Like the generosity has to sit with the power, as coming back to that kind of who steps away from the table to let other voices in. What that looks like, I suppose, is that kind of creation of space. It feels like that was the beginnings of what you were talking about, but
yeah. That certainly resonates very much with me, and I'm sure I have a sense it does with Osman. Do you want to respond to that?
I was just going to say, I think my own personal view is that the casting's actually been way ahead in terms of the theatre, in terms of representation, and it is, if you see it, you can be it, and that's been great. But the rest of the administration and the backstage stuff is miles behind, and it fills me with hope that we've done it in one part of our business, so it's there and possible that we can do it in another. But just one sort of slight point that you touched on there at the end as well, that I wanted to just say is that I think it's also important to think about the makeup of the boards of these organisations as well, and that there is maybe gender diversity, there's maybe not so much age diversity, and different voices, different backgrounds, from that sort of stuff who are going to come with different questions and challenge in a different way. And if somebody like Emma is at the Globe for 2 years, like the board are going to be there for much longer. They're the people who might be able to sort of maintain a changed culture and make sure the organisation, whoever it's led by, is sort of held to account and lives it, because that's what we need everyone to do.
Good point. There's another question. Sorry, Martin, was it? Yeah, Brad back, yeah.
I'll ask Luke a question about constraints on leadership. I loved your radical vision of things you're trying to do and the way it was inherited from your grandparents, great-grandparents, even if it did take 50 years for the penny to drop. But here you are now in a venerable institution within a larger institution, University of Cambridge, that does not have a great reputation for rapid change, but you're the boss, you're the director. So what stops you? What constrains you?
Well, I suppose it's a number of things. I think that these are institutions where people, individuals, because I think one of the things that's been useful about this discussion is that we have moved from the sort of broad principles to actually some of the realities of how people work together. People change at different paces, and there are colleagues, it would be fair to say at the FITS, who say, when are we going to go back to doing the things we really do? When are we going to stop doing this trendy stuff? And the answer is that we haven't stopped doing those other things. It's about, I keep saying it's not either or, it's about amplification. But sometimes that's not always understood, and that's so there's a process of internal onboarding, if I can call it something like that, which is important, really important, which is why that process of continual listening is crucial, and not just listening, asking questions. I mean, there's some boring Cambridge structural stuff which I won't share with all of you, because it really is boring for me, and I can't therefore imagine how dull it would be for all of you. But that doesn't help a sort of, and I think it's a sort of microcosmic example of what I was talking about before, of not necessarily joined up effort. We've talked about, in certain contexts, forms of competition between institutions, between individuals, which don't always necessarily actually help us achieve our ends. And then finally, in terms of constraints, I would say it's money. It often comes down to money. I hate to be so, vulgar, but it's, we want to get things going, and getting things going means choosing projects that contain the seeds of change. That so you're not just saying I'm going to do this. You're actually choosing things to do that then contain that change within it. And those can be initiatives of the kind we heard about, the brilliant initiative that the Globe has of bringing people in aged 18 to experience, to work within an organisation without necessarily a kind of set experience or challenging the kind of traditional notions of qualifications that somebody to work in a university museum of the venerability of the FITS would be expected to have. Those are projects that require organisation and funding and sustaining with people who organise them, and that's on top of the work that an organisation is already doing. So being realistic, you want to do these things. And Karen will testify, we're working together and with others to try and do this, but it's not always easy to find those, So that's one of the reasons I talked about trying to find funding bodies that put the FITS together with Black Blossoms, or I'm just using that metaphorically for the time being, but do that sort of thing, because it's through partnerships and through sustaining things in that way that I think we will get that work done. And so yes, we can help, we can try and do things internally, but forms of external facilitation very much directed at this kind of effort are crucial, and because they help organizations reset.
Thank you. Melanie.
I was wondering, you spoke earlier about
Sam here.
you spoke earlier about knowing that the new leadership positions need to go to women in the theatre world, and I was wondering, like, how do the men respond to that? Because we obviously, I know, like, as soon as you open the paper and there's like, we need more women here, and men get very defensive, but intimately within your industry, how do you navigate that kind of conversation with other men artistic directors, and knowing that there is going to be a shift in leadership, and like, is there an anxiety amongst the men that you work with that would mean there would be a pushback for women?
No, I don't think so. But the big caveat is that that hasn't happened yet. So there is, if you're speaking to everybody on a one-to-one basis, on a personal basis, then they would say, looking dead in your eyes, they're not looking at gender at all, or any other sort of characteristic of somebody. If they're a director that they respect or like their work, then they're going to want to work with them and put them on regardless of that. So I think they would. The majority of people, maybe I'll just work with nice people, I don't know, but the majority of people, I would say, you're definitely not. But the reality doesn't seem to reflect that quite yet, and I don't know whether it's that difference of when you are actually faced with losing your job, you then maybe are getting more, or you get more defensive about it and protect more. But I don't think when you're speaking to people on a personal level at all, actually, but there's a big but in that, isn't there? Yeah.
Yeah, two more here in front. Perhaps is it Charlotte? Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, thanks. All such really stimulating talks, and I just following on from sort of previous questions. This question of progression right through to leadership for women, and just I'm struggling, particularly thinking about the academic context and museums and galleries in particular. This problem of short-term contracts and how you sustain development for women when they're constantly looking for the next job, or how the problematics of that in relation to maternity leave, and just kind of really thinking through a longer term vision and supporting them through to leadership. So it's sort of a practical question,
Well, certainly in the academic sphere, it's certainly it's a real issue, and it's sort of built into our current academic economies. I mean, that's true in Cambridge, but perhaps in a slightly more bolstered way. I can't tell because there are colleges in the Central University, but it is an issue. We're looking at it hard. We want to address it, but it's a sort of conundrum. We're looking at it, but we're not going to replace all of the short-term contracts with all full-time tenured posts. I mean, that's not easily viable. So what you have to do is at the same time look at all the conditions lying behind it as well. But it's again step by step. I think all I can say is very, very aware of it, and looking at it in a more holistic way than we have in the past. That's the academic scenario. We have a gallery, of course. We have short-term project contracts there too. Not very small number in relation to the total curatorial body, in fact, but they still exist for particular exhibitions, for particular projects, and so on. The progression issue is problematic, and it particularly it feels more so now, given that certainly the museums and galleries industry has gone into a recession. A lot of junior jobs have been lost. In the previous decade, it was still expanding, and so it felt more optimistic. Even if, as often happened, people have 2 or 3 or even 4 years of sequential short-term contracts, there was still a sense that there was the potential of a permanent role coming up. I think that, I don't know what you think, Luke, but it feels, in our world, it feels much less optimistic at the moment. Though, as Maria said last night, the economy of major museums and galleries, for example, is beginning to build up again. But they have gone through a terrible 2-year period, which makes it feel very uncomfortable. And likewise in the academic world, I mean, we've managed to keep, we've done everything we can not to lose any jobs, and we haven't lost any jobs at all. We've worked very hard on a lot of other cost cutting and more fundraising, whatever, just to achieve that we didn't hit posts. But at the same time, there's a big concern about pay review, about improving salaries, and of course, back to pounds, the financial pressures are huge on us all across the industry, if we're also trying to deliver change. So that's what keeps me awake at night. It's balancing all of those things, because you sort of can't. So how do you pace it? Yeah, they're all interconnected, yeah. Debbie, I think you had your hand up. There's one more at the back, yeah.
Thank you. No, it's a question for Luke. I was really intrigued. I'm not at all surprised that you didn't want to reply to that email from the Daily Telegraph, but it did make me think, what is the message to give? How do you deal with that sort of on a proactive basis so that you're not feeding into what will obviously be a sort of story you can already see coming out in headlines? So how can you affect the news lines, if you like, when you make acquisitions in the policies that you're developing and build the narrative that would be more constructive?
It's the key question at the moment. I mean, we were reminded this morning that for better or worse, something called the culture wars are happening, sometimes more or less stoked up, depending on where we are in a sort of political cycle. Extraordinarily, I think the football has caused government to back off a bit on some of this, which is interesting. But that said, one of the things that we really want to do is to work with comms experts to actually, and this is the project that the University Museums Group is going to be undertaking, to tell them what we're doing and help that they can help us. I know this sounds a bit evasive, craft that language that is crisp and clear and iterable if people in the museum world and beyond want to use it, so that there's a sense of a community language of effort in this area. I don't have it yet. I wish I did. What I say is, how can we ignore aspects of the past that affect who we are today? How can we pretend that those things didn't happen? It's not about either ors. It's not about this is good and this is bad. It's about the complexity of the past that leads to today. And my general argument is that objects, works of art, artifacts, visual culture, which is my terrain, are quite simple paths to complexity. That objects have multiple meanings, and that our jobs are to tease those out and to look at those contradictions and to explore the ways in which the readings of these objects depend on who you are, who's telling you what, who these things were owned by, and who owns them now, how we show them, how we research them, what forms of expertise do we bring to them, both within the museum and as the consumers of those objects. There isn't a single right answer. Why shouldn't we have a discussion? And that's the simple thing. So there's no. I mean, what I find so iniquitous about what the message is that we're being told that it's an either or. One of the things that I find fascinating in, for example, the project that we're doing around the legacies of enslavement, it's a response to the Cambridge University's investigation here, is that the Fens, Wisbech, Soham, towns nearby to Cambridge, have a history of abolitionism. One of them was where Equiano lived at the end of his life, which resonate with other much less completely deplorable histories that sit within Cambridge itself. It's rich, it's varied, and it doesn't mean that we've got the city, the liberal, wicked academic city investigating something in order to knock other things down, because those things that we're investigating sit within the culture of the Fenland, which is supposed to be the opposition. And that's what I'm sorry, you see, I'm already making it uncrisp, but that's the message.
Yeah, great, thanks. And I think maybe it should be the last question right at the back. Yeah.
Thank you. It's been such an inspiring 2 days. I realized that we touched a few times on the speed of change. How long will it take to get there? And I noticed yesterday Maria Basho talked about how she is now there's going to be a show around Lubina Himid, but she's at the end of her career, she's an older woman. And this idea of now it's fine to roll out the old women. But what will it take to have a show on a young person of color, female, at the Tate, say? Do you think that the old generation will see that happen? Or are we waiting for Gen Z or next generation to see that happen? Do we have to do it? Can't we jump a phase here to get there quicker?
Well, I think a lot of... Sorry,
You're
just
the
barged
right
in.
No, you're the right person. I was going to pass to you, believe you me.
But I think that a lot of work is happening. And for example, Lynette Yadam Bayaki, who is, I think, 40 years old, just had a huge retrospective at Tate Britain, which was incredible and so meaningful. Zanele Maholi, a South African non-binary artist, had quite a sizable exhibition at Tate Modern. So I think that there definitely is progress that's being made. And I completely understand the frustration of artists like Lubina Himid, who have been asking for decades to be recognised. And she and Maude Salter worked so much in the 80s to try and get recognition for themselves and for other black women artists, and it fell on completely deaf ears. And Lubina Himid has described the 90s as the wilderness years, because in the 80s there was some kind of energy, and then in the 90s just total silence and lack of funding from public sources, and they struggled as they didn't have private wealth to kind of fund their arts projects either. So I think that for some women, unfortunately, that kind of recognition has come late, and it's the responsibility of curators and researchers and museum directors and everyone to elevate them and to research their works and produce archives on them. And it was such a rewarding experience doing that for Maude Salter. A lot of her poetry collections are out of print. One of them costs £1,000 to buy on Amazon. And so they're only accessible in libraries and archives. And I spoke to the director of Innova, which is an organisation that specifically champions artists of colour, and they said that they want to reprint her collection of essays, passion, discourses on black women's creativity, and I think that kind of thing is so important. So I think there is change, but we all need to do it pretty damn fast.
I think that's a great note to end on. I think that's the mantra, I think, now. But so first of all, I just thank you all for your patience in this session. And thank you for me personally for everything I've heard and learned and been able to share this last 24 hours. It's been fantastic. And thank you very much to all my panel for all they've offered this afternoon. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Thank you.